Hello and welcome to another episode of All About Books. Thank you for viewing. I'm Jay Taylor with Warren Berkeley, and this is our first broadcast of 2021. Warren, hello. Happy New Year. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, Jay. It's great to have another episode all ready for January of 2021. And Jay and I are very fortunate. We believe our viewers are going to be delighted that we have with us Gary Henry, who I think would want us to say, by the grace of God, has made valuable contributions to our understanding and has encouraged us with a number of books and resources over the past years. I write book reviews for Pressing On magazine, and here's what I'm going to say about Gary's writing in the February issue. Gary not only has a good understanding of scripture and writing and publishing, he brings all of that to his readers. He understands people and needs and trends. So we're very pleased to have with us in this interview, Gary Henry. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Warren. Glad to be with you guys.
Well, Gary, we want to thank you for joining us today, and we've got some questions we want to go over with you. Most of the people that we talk to grew up reading. Share with us your early reading habits and maybe a couple of books that influenced you early on.
Well, my earliest reading memories have to do with the Encyclopedia Britannica, strangely enough. Maybe that would explain a few things about me, I don't know. But my parents bought a set of Britannica when I was probably 10 or 11. And I still remember getting those down on the floor and just running my hands over the pages, and that opened up my eyes to the world of knowledge and to how many branches there are on the tree of knowledge, and really it gave me a vision of wanting to learn a lot about a lot of different subjects. When I got to high school, I discovered J.R.R. Tolkien. I still remember when Niels Erikson, a friend of mine, handed me a copy of The Hobbit and told me what it was. And I've been reading Tolkien constantly since then. When I finish his corpus, I simply start over. And so I've probably learned more truth from those books, other than the Bible itself, than anything else. When I got to college, I think it was Melvin Curry who introduced me to C.S. Lewis. And that was transformative. And then it was also in college that I discovered Robert F. Turner. Our Brother Turner was doing Plain Talk in those years, mailing it out free to anybody who wanted it. And Brother Turner showed us all how much could be done with one page. And so probably no surprise that I turned out to write in the format of single pages. And very, very indebted to Brother Turner, not only for his writing and the influence that it had, but I was fortunate enough to get to know him personally, and he was very encouraging to me as a Christian and also a writer. So those are the things that got me started off in reading and loving knowledge.
So your reading habits kind of turned into writing habits and then publishing now what you're writing. You have this book, Obeying the Gospel. This is the 5th volume in your Word Points Daybook series. How did you get into writing and publishing? Tell us about that.
Well, when I started preaching back then, congregations had bulletins, and as a preacher, you would write articles for the bulletin. And so I'd done a tremendous lot of short article writing, and then for periodicals, monthly magazines published by Brethren. And so I had done for many years a lot of writing in short form articles. And I think I always had in the back of my mind that at some point I wanted to write some books, but it was many years before I began to have any idea really what I wanted to do in terms of a project that would be book length. And it really was in 1999, in the midst of a very painful personal crisis, that the agony of that personal trauma caused me to want to do some writing that would have to do with my faith. I really had to redig the wells of my own faith. And I had long been interested in Hebrews 11, verse 6, about diligently seeking God. And so in 1999, I began working on what I hoped would be a book-length project based on the idea of diligently seeking God. And so I had, in early years, right out of college, had worked in the publishing business. And so back then it was much harder to self-publish than it is now. But having worked in the publishing business, I knew how that business operated. And so it was fairly easy for me to self-publish Diligently Seeking God, which I did. And at that time, I really didn't know that that would turn into a series of books. I simply wanted to write on that passage, that concept, and did. And then one thing led to another, and now we've got a series of 7 books if I live long enough to get all 7 written.
Thank you, Gary. There are a lot of different formats that writers in the devotional category could use: expository, topical, academic, narrative. You have successfully used a format that could be called daybook. Explain that and tell us why you chose that format.
Well, it was almost an accidental process. I had started working on Diligently Seeking God, gathering ideas, writing bits and pieces here and there. And I really don't remember, but at some point it occurred to me that putting this in the form of short standalone essays that taken together would develop the theme, that would be better than simply writing a long dissertation on that passage. And so I decided to put it in the form of a book, 366 short essays, each a page long. They'll be for each day of the year. That format is a very popular format. If you go to the bookstore, you'll find a lot of books, either religious devotionals or even secular books where there's a reading for each day of the year. And it struck me that probably would make the book accessible to a lot more people than just a long, dry discussion of the point. We are all busy these days, and you have to catch people on the run. And so a short reading for each day of the year seemed to be a format that would make that material accessible to more people. It turned out to be the right decision. I can't pretend that I knew how all of this was going to go, but it turned out to be the right decision. I am quite sure that these books have been used by many, many more people in this format than they would have been if I just written a big long tome on these subjects.
Well, you do a very good job of maintaining thematic content. And in fact, I've got a confession to make. I'm at March 8 in Obeying the Gospel. You pull me into a theme, and I think I know where you're going with that theme, and so I just keep reading. And so I hope that's okay that I'm at March 8.
That's fine.
Yeah. I just love that format. And a lot of the other books that use that format do not have thematic connection. Right. The way yours do. And that pulls the reader in. And you maintain the same format in each of these articles. Your top line is always uppercase, and then you've got a quote at the bottom, right?
Right.
You started that with the first book, didn't you?
Right.
Yeah.
One thing about this format, you can write a book like this very differently than you would write any other book, because these pages are independent. I mean, taken together, they develop the idea of the book, but each page stands alone. So they don't necessarily have to be written in the order that they're going to finally appear in the book. I can just write 366 of these and then sit down and say, okay, now what order do they need to go in? And so then there's the challenge of sequencing them in a good way.
Well, that's interesting. I just imagined that you had them sequenced in your writing plan first.
Well, I did originally. With Diligently Seeking God, the pages as they are in the book, that's the order that they were written in. But that has changed over time. And with Obeying the Gospel, I really it was such a vast project that I really couldn't foresee at the beginning of the project what all I would need to be writing on before it was over. So I just began writing, and then other things would occur to me that needed to be dealt with. And so when I got to the end of having written 366 pages, and I had over 800 ideas for pages before I started Obeying the Gospel. So I had to cull out, which 366 of these do I want to write on. But when I got finished, it was a major project to put those 366 articles in the order that you find them in the book.
I would imagine so. Now, Gary, everybody wants to write, and it's very easy to write and publish nowadays. With the advent of digital publishing and print on demand, it's much easier to publish today than it was 10, 20 years ago. But that means there are a lot of writers flooding the market with books very quickly put together. And sometimes they exhibit poor quality and they look like they were put together quickly. So before everybody gets a book out, what advice would you offer to people who want to write and publish?
Well, humorously, when I'm asked typically by young people, what do I need to do to become a writer? My advice is don't do it. Don't, if you can not do it, don't. But that's only half serious. I think there is something to be said for putting the brakes on an impulse like that and thinking that through. I really feel that none of us have something to say that's worth putting into a book-length project until a little bit later in life. I mentioned Melvin Curry. I think it was Brother Curry who one time somebody asked him in class why he had never written a book, and he said, I wouldn't think about writing a book until I'm at least 50, and he was not at that time. He said that tongue in cheek, but the point is well taken. As young people, if you've ever gone back and read anything that you wrote as a young person, it's embarrassing. And how often we would think, I wish I had held back that impulse a little bit later. And so, in all seriousness, I think there's something to be said for putting the reins on that impulse to rush into print. Now, write. When I have people ask me, how do I become a writer? I say, well, start writing. And they say, well, I mean, a published writer. Well, that's a very different question. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was not the first piece of music that he ever wrote. And so when you publish a book, that ought not to be the first thing that you have written. There ought to be a ton of journeyman work that you have written just for the sake of honing your craft and figuring out what it is you really do believe, and those kinds of things. And so start writing and write as much as you can without any thought of publishing. And then eventually something will flip your switch, and it'll be obvious to you that there's something that's a fire burning inside of you that needs to be put in the form of a book and to be published. And when that time comes, you generally know that. But do a lot of writing before you even think about publishing any of it.
Why didn't you tell me this 40 years ago?
I tried to, Warren. Well, we've all, I was going back not too long ago and rereading Ed Harold's Emergence of the Church of Christ denomination. And he wrote that right out of college. And a few years ago, he revised it and wrote a new preface to it. And he said, have you ever read anything that you wrote 40 years ago?
Yeah.
And tried to improve it. So
I read stuff that I did a week ago and want to revise it, and sometimes do. All right, we've got a lightning round that's going to kind of break up our interview a little bit. Just quick answers, and I think I know some of these because I know Gary pretty well. Best hamburger?
Well, best local hamburger place is Chris Madrid's in San Antonio, Texas. Best franchise hamburger for me is Whataburger, and they also are a Texas company.
Yeah. And the last time I was with you, I think we had burgers at White Castle's, right?
All right. That might
But
be
that,
the third tier.
yeah, I think that would be it. Best time of the day for you to write?
Probably between 8 and 10 in the morning. I mean, when I'm writing, I write longer than that, but that would be the prime time. Those would be the hours when I'm freshest and it's going more smoothly. I used to write early in the morning, but if I would discipline myself to get up and write early in the morning, the ideas would be they would sound like sleepy ideas. And so
I think I remember you telling me that when you were doing local work, you did your writing before the start of the day. Is that right?
When I was writing Diligently Seeking God, I would get up at about 4:30 in the morning, try to be at the desk writing by 5. But that was very difficult for me because I'm not a morning person. And my brother Phil, who lives down in Bowling Green, Kentucky, would call me every morning at 5 to make sure I was writing. But I just can't do that anymore.
Wow. Bible software, what do you use and like?
Well, I still just use eSword. I use Bible software very minimally, and so that does what I need. Sometimes I use the Word for a little bit more intensive word studies and those kinds of things. I have Logos, but I use it very rarely.
Okay, here's an important question, really important question. Jay, you want to take notes on this next question because someday you'll reflect on this. Best way to connect with your grandchildren?
Well, I'm not sure about the way to connect, but the best place to connect is a donut shop. And I think grandkids and donuts connect up very well. And so donut shops.
Do you text with your grandkids?
Not yet. All of my grandkids are still too young to have their own cell phone, but I will.
I text with my grandkids, especially during the pandemic. I find that texting and email with my grandkids is a really good way to connect with them. They sort of expect it now.
Right.
We absolutely love our grandchildren. Jay, take us somewhere else.
Well, Gary, Warren and I really enjoy reading. We like talking about new books, but above all, we like talking about and encouraging daily Bible reading. So what does daily Bible reading look like for you? And then what do you recommend to others?
Well, I use a very straightforward daily Bible reading program that I've used virtually all of my adult life. And it's just a straightforward 7-day a week, go through the Bible from Genesis to Revelation every year. So I just start over every year. And the beauty of having used that same program every year, all these years, I read the same portion of the Bible on the same day every year. So my birthday is January 31st. And so the reading for that day is the last 5 chapters of Exodus. And so I build the tabernacle every year on my birthday. But that works for me. A lot of people don't prefer a 7-day program. They would prefer a 5-day program to have a little time off. But I have just really enjoyed the discipline of reading a portion of the scriptures every day of the week and covering the entire Bible. I really feel strongly about whether you do it in the form of a daily reading program or whatever, that we need to read every page in the Bible on some kind of a regular basis, whether it's every year, every 2 years, or whatever. There's not any part of God's word that we need not to have seen within a relatively short time frame. I mean, all of it's important. And we dare not get so enamored with certain parts of the Bible that we don't pay any attention to the rest of it. So a program that takes me through the whole Bible every year has been very important. Now, to me, there's a difference between daily Bible reading and Bible study. I try to tell people that reading program that's going to take you through the Bible every year, that's just the foundation. On top of that, then you're going to need to do some regular, serious, in-depth study of the Bible. And you certainly can't study the Bible in depth every year. But start with that reading and exercise discipline about getting that done every year. And then on top of that, be studying maybe some book of the Bible in more depth all the time.
Good. Gary, what in your view should we learn from the pandemic?
Well, there's so many lessons. It certainly has been a vivid reminder of how unpredictable life is and really how little control we have over what happens. As you may know, I'm an avid student of Ecclesiastes, and one of the main points of Ecclesiastes is that outside of Eden, God has subjected this world to futility and made it impossible for us to understand everything we'd like to understand about it and control everything about it that we would like to control. This pandemic has been a vivid demonstration of the fact that despite all that we have learned how to do, there's still things that lie outside our control. And we desperately need to learn that lesson. That ought to be what humbles us and brings us to the foot of God's throne. And so it takes periodic reminders for an arrogant secular world to be reminded that despite our vaunted ability to control some things, that God can throw us a curve anytime he wants to. And it should remind us of what James said, that before we say we're going to do this or we're going to do that, we ought to factor into our thinking the fact that God may or may not allow those plans to materialize.
Good. Thank you, Gary. The book that recently was published, Obeying the Gospel, and we're going to put a link underneath this video where you can see all of Gary's material. He started a podcast. There is some Bible reading plans in there for families. Is that right, Gary?
Right. Those are Monday through Friday kind of daily devotional themes that gives families a framework that they can talk about these things together.
Great. WordPoint's Daybook Series. Gary Henry, thank you.
You
for
are
all
so
you
welcome.
do.
Glad to be with you guys.
Okay, we'll be back some other time with some other author with All About Books. Thank you.